So I'm talking about parameters again, which is very, very similar, but it will be different, I'm sure. So yeah, I'm talking about how working within parameters can actually help people be creative. And often the things that we feel constrict us and stop us doing what we want to be doing actually could help us, and maybe we should embrace those things. I'm kind of a designer by trade. I've had stints as a commercial artist and an illustrator, and I learned a long time ago to try and embrace this stuff, because if you don't and you fight against parameters and restrictions, then you get frustrated, and that's not a great place to be. So you have to kind of accept these things, but also try and kind of work within them. So I do work for money. I think most people here probably do that. So, you know, as a commercial artist or a designer, there are things that restraints that I have that I think all of you will have. Time and money. Time and money could be the same thing. I need it tomorrow and I haven't got any money. The brief. I've given a brief. What is that? That's crazy. Do I need to question that brief? What you're asking me to do here? Expertise, can I actually do this thing? Do I have to wing it? Do I know someone who knows how to do it? Can I ask them? The paymaster, who am I working for? Can I get on with them? The clients, is this someone I can work with? And there's a ton of other things. As someone working with brands, I'll be given some brand guidelines, and then suddenly I'm constrained within those guidelines, so how far can I push those things? I think accessibility is a great example of something where everything needs to be accessible. Of course it does. But rather than looking at that as a restraint, we should be embracing those things. And there's probably a ton of other things that we could think of there. So I'm going to take you back in time, and I've got some examples of people and movements and individuals that have inspired me, and have kind of inspired an aesthetic and a style and a way of working that are still used today. And all the examples I'm going to show today are kind of pre-internet. They're not digital at all. But are things that have really things that I look at and really inspire me, and hopefully they'll inspire you too. So we do have some designers in the room, I know that. Does anyone know who this guy is? Yes. Oh, cheat. That's such a cheat. So this is Paul Renner, and he designed Futura, the typeface. And Futura, it's the type of tomorrow. Sorry, it's the type of today and tomorrow. And Futura was released sort of 1927, so 20s type. And you will all know this typeface if you like vodka. You will know this typeface if you like the films of Stanley Kubrick. You will like this typeface. If you've seen any Wes Anderson films, you've seen this typeface. If you like kind of late 80s, early 90s conceptual art, you'll know this typeface. It's absolutely everywhere. And Renner's kind of restriction or parameter really was his ideology. He was a modernist. He wasn't a member of the Bauhaus, but he sort of travelled in the same circles, and he kind of was working at the same time. And he really strongly believed in those modernist principles of form following function. No decoration unless it's really needed, and there for a purpose. And he was a very principled man. This is a room full of Nazis. Just some Nazis. So early in the Nazis regime, they kind of denounced all sorts of various art design. Everyone's heard of degenerate art. They didn't like abstract art. They hated modernism. They shut the Bauhaus down. They were very nasty people. Renner took offence to all this, and by this time, this is kind of the late 30s, Renner was kind of knocking on 60, and he was a very mild-mannered man, was Renner. He didn't like dancing, he didn't like jazz, but he was a modernist, and he was very, very principled. And in particular, he really hated blackletter. Now, black letter is the typeface that the Nazi regime were promoting. They were saying, no, this is really Germanic, this is all about our culture, everyone should be using black letter, which is a load of rubbish, because black letter predates the whole nation of Germany, so that was a load of rubbish anyway. But Renner, he took great offence at this, because this is terrible, this is completely unreadable font, everyone should be using, you know, lovely modernist typefaces and stuff. So what does he do? He published a pamphlet, which was basically attacking the Nazis, saying, no, you're all rubbish, you don't know what you're on about, modernism's absolutely fantastic. And they threw him in jail for a short while. And he got out, he was all right, he went over the board to Switzerland and kind of saw out the war and came back. But I want to talk about his typeface Futura. And another principle of Renner's is that ideology he had. He was under the assumption that a typeface would be much more legible if it was made out of pure geometric shapes. So this is an early cut. I'm using the pointer, no one else uses the pointer. I mean, there's going to be a lot of pointer action. This is a first cut and you can see he's really kind of going for it here. Look at these G's. I mean, he's really trying to boil down everything down into really simple, just simple shapes. And it turns out he was actually wrong. There's a lot of research that actually says no, that's nothing to do with legibility. But he's still created this absolutely beautiful typeface that I love. It's one of my favourite typefaces. And it's absolutely everywhere is this typeface. And once you start seeing it, you will see it absolutely everywhere. And that shows how much of a successful typeface it was. It's kind of really... you know, it has no real... there are other geometric typefaces that came out about the same time, but many look at Futura as kind of the original geometric typeface, the original typeface that was just made out of these shapes. There obviously were others at the time. No one can say, oh, we had the first geometric typeface. Like a lot of things in design, there's kind of a zeitgeist, things come out at the same time, and this is kind of what happened with geometric typefaces. But Futura is kind of the standard. And I think if you're about sort of tomorrow walking around town, you're looking at signage, if you do see these kind of like a little lowercase a and it's a circle with a little bar next to it, it might not be Futura, but it will be related to Futura, inspired by Futura, or inspired by a typeface that came out in the 20s similar to Futura. And so if I think about Renner, you know, he was a principled man, and the parameters that he set himself created this amazing work. He set himself these really severe parameters of purely boiling down a typeface of just pure geometric faces, shapes, and he's made this really successful typeface. So, here's some French people writing. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the Paris riots of May 1968. Now, these riots were a kind of 2-week-long disturbance. It was started off by students, and then factory workers took up the mantle and also kind of went on strike and occupied factories. And there was 2 weeks of quite severe running battles with the French police, rather authoritarian French police, on the streets of Paris. This unrest began with student occupations, so students started occupying universities and schools, and they were protesting against capitalism, against consumerism, and against kind of American imperialism. And they looked at their government of Charles de Gaulle, and they didn't see them standing up to this at all, and they just thought that the government was completely out of touch with young people. So they were trying to make a stand, and they were really protesting about it. So what I want to talk about these young men and women is the protest posters that they produced and the kind of environment that they were in while they were creating these posters and this artwork. And their constraint and their parameter was the state. It was the French government, the state. So these students, they occupied the Paris School of Fine Art. And they every evening they had to come up with an idea, draw it, get it down on paper, create some screens for some screen printing, screen print the posters, let them dry, and then get out on the streets and splat them all around the walls and streets of Paris, while the police were trying to stop them and trying to rip down these posters. And ironically, to say that they were protesting against kind of American imperialism and capitalism, they were taking a lot of cues from advertising and billboards and the same kind of visual language. This is Charles de Gaulle. He himself was very image conscious. He portrayed himself as this military man. He always wears his hat, which is called a kepi, which I only found out the other day. And you can see here by the shadow here that he has rather a large nose. Now, this is important because the students use this against him. So they kind of characterised him. They made him into a caricature. And by simplifying and boiling down this character into this simple kind of cartoon, it meant any artist, any one of these students could draw Charles de Gaulle and it would be instantly recognisable. And these students, they knew the importance of repeated imagery, of a really simple message and the impact of what an image can be. This here is be young and shut up, basically. ORTF was the kind of equivalent of the BBC, so this is de Gaulle defecating his propaganda out into everyone. And I think this was quite self-explanatory. But these are really amazing illustrations and really strong imagery done under exceptional circumstances. It had to be drawn and printed, dried and up on walls literally within hours. The police were also easy to characterise and also a target to the students. They had these very, I'm using this pointer loads, they had this really distinctive kind of helmet, and the students did the same thing. They were a target for them for these posters. Now this is a really iconic poster here, Nazis again. And over here we've got borders equals repression. And this middle one, the students that were occupying this, the School of Fine Art, they got kicked out in the end. The police came in there, booted them all out. It's quite violent. And this is basically saying, you know, the police occupy the School of Fine Art, well, the School of Fine Art will occupy the street. So they carried on. They found other places to do it, to create this work and get it out there in the streets so everyone could see it. And something else that the students did, they actively campaigned to try and get the workers striking and protesting with them, and they did this through these posters, through word of mouth, and trying to communicate these messages. So this repeated icon of the factory and, you know, occupy the factories was a message they put out on the streets every night. And the workers did. They came out, and the French like a strike. They came out and they had 2 weeks of strikes, and this has kind of left. What this has left us with is this huge kind of historical document, really. It not only is it amazing artwork that I think, you know, you can see the influence of this work in a lot of modern illustration work, but it's left us with this amazing sort of social document. And as well as defining an aesthetic, you know, that's really important. And I took this photo just around the corner. I don't know who the artist is. Maybe someone here knows who they are. But I look at this work and I see a direct link between the work that those students were doing in 1968 under such high pressure. So I think it's amazing to see that there's that legacy still there, and that art that they produced was so important. Charles de Gaulle, he didn't get kicked out, he came back stronger than ever, but it did cause a kind of a cultural revolution in France, which I think was very important. And those parameters of, you know, time, the state being against you, created this amazing work, all out on the streets for everyone to see. So, this is another old white guy. This guy is Wim Quell. Has anyone heard of Wim Quell? Wim Quell. Hey, Wim Quell. He's 90 now, so he's still alive. He's 90. He's a Dutch graphic designer, and he's they're innovative, they're influential, and absolutely obsessed by grids. This is how I like to think of Vim. This is Vim in the 60s. I think this was from a photo shoot, but I like to think that this is how he dressed every day. That he got up in the morning and he put his metal neck brace on, got his fancy modernist thing and his fancy modern stuff, and went to his office. Vim was absolutely obsessed with grids. He was a modernist, absolutely obsessed with grids. But he was also, which is obviously a self-imposed restriction, a bit like Renner, it's an ideology. But there's also a kind of a technology aspect to the kind of parameters and restrictions that are on his work, which I'll talk about in a minute. So first I just want to show some of his artwork, really iconic stuff. All based on an invisible grid. He really promoted this grid. All his work was based on this typographic grid that he laid all his work out with. And he was also very much a type designer, very much into designing typefaces. And again, these typefaces, a bit like Renner, he was trying to boil these typefaces down into simple shapes, repeated patterns, all based around a grid. And again, this is quite a famous poster of Vim's, and it doesn't maybe seem much now, but at the time this was kind of blowing people's minds, because what Vim did is he exposed the grid. He kind of actually went, I'm actually going to have the grid on my poster, and this at the time was like, wow, this is amazing. This is so postmodern. It's kind of crazy. And you can see that he's taken his type design one step further. In here, you know, the type, it looks a bit gritty. You can see what he's trying to do, but he really does tie the type directly to the grid here. He's creating a typeface purely out of this grid. So quite a famous point in graphic design. But what happened around this time as well, and it was actually 1968, if you believe Wikipedia, and he, so the same time that these riots were happening in Paris, Vim, with his neck brace on and his pleats, he went to a technology show in Holland. And what he saw there were cathode ray displays, so old tube television kind of displays, but not showing moving images, but showing messages and signage. And this kind of shocked him, because what he saw was how limiting it was, how absolutely awful it was. And if you're trying to display large type that's been designed for print on this really restrictive low resolution screen, it looked absolutely terrible. So he was kind of like, oh, he felt he needed to do something about this. So he decided to design a typeface specifically for use on these really, really low resolution screens. And he knew it wasn't going to be a typeface that was going to commercially use, because it was kind of a little bit out there. But he wanted to kind of start a conversation with the design community. So he created this new alphabet typeface, an introduction for a program typography, it says there. And obviously this is interesting, because it's like, well, you know, it's based on the parameters of the displays that were around at the time. But also it's a little bit unusable, because, I mean, look at his A. It's just kind of like, ooh, you can kind of work out what it is, but you kind of nearly need to interpret it. But he knew this. The whole point of it was, let's start the discussion, let's get designers talking about it. And it did. It created a whole kind of movement of people thinking about type differently. And now type designers, they have to think about digital first. How's the hinting going to happen? You know, how does it display on screens? Now, I did say that this was not really used commercially. There's one commercial use of it that I was familiar with growing up. Joy Division. Yeah, who's heard of Joy Division? There's a few more hands, maybe not. So he used it on Substance and Atmosphere. This wasn't Peter Saville, who's kind of famous, usually associated with Joy Division. It was someone else. But it's the only time I've ever seen this out in the wild. So if anyone does see this new alphabet anywhere, I'd love to see it. But Vim carried on. He carried on making typefaces and graphic design, all based around grids, and these are much more usable, much more readable. And I think there's a direct link here with something like Chicago, which I'm sure some of you will have seen. This was designed by Susan Kare for Apple in 1984. And it was specifically designed, it was bitmap font specifically designed for low resolution screens. And I see a direct link between this work and the theory that Vim did decades ago. On a personal note, I didn't have a Mac in 1983, but I did have a Commodore 64, so I used to see stuff like this all the time. And that's got Vim Quell all around. It's one of his typefaces, and his typefaces that he did with these grids that were designed for print ended up getting co-opted for digital displays. So these kind of parameters of technology and these self-imposed parameters of grid has created these amazing typefaces and kind of some amazing work. So now I'm in the 70s, and I'm going to talk about Penguin, the publisher. And this is kind of a group of designers, unnamed designers, there's quite a lot of them, and printers as well, because it's not just, with book publishing, it's not just the designers, it's how, when that design gets to the print shop, it's then how is it worked then, how is colour used, etc., what are the techniques that you can use. And Penguin were the first people to publish kind of pulp paperbacks, and that was kind of in the 30s. And that was fantastic because they made books affordable for everyone. So the masses could suddenly have knowledge, they didn't have to spend a load of money on books. A paperback book cost the same price as a pack of cigarettes, and that was kind of amazing. Not cigarettes, but affordable books. Now, a lot of people kind of, when they think of Penguin and design, they think of the grid again, another grid. A bit like Vim, and let's put everything by a grid, which is good because these paperbacks mass-produced, they had to look the same. You had to know that they were Penguin books. So they had to have some kind of uniformity, but then they were allowed to go kind of crazy on the illustrations and the designs. But I don't want to talk about grids about here. I want to talk about use of colour, because the big restraint with the printers and the publishers of these books was to keep the costs down. They had to be really, really cheap because that was the point of them. Every colour that was applied on one of these books is more money, more expense. So they had to keep the amount of colours used really, really low. And that's a kind of really relatable problem because, as I mentioned before, if I'm working with brand guidelines or something like that, sometimes I've only got a small set of colours to work with. And how can I stretch those and make those really effective? And there are techniques here that illustrators use even now. Here you can see there's two colours, there's the green and the black. The white is actually the paper, so they're getting this third colour through the paper. And there's some really clever use of colour here, just popping out these parts. And if they were really, really lucky, they'd get an extra colour. So I can put a little bit of red here, Maybe these are a little bit later. But what I want to talk about with Penguin and colour in particular are two techniques that were kind of born out of this financial restriction: duotone and overprinting. Duotone, is kind of half-tone printing when you superimpose it over another colour. So this kind of here and kind of here is kind of what we'd call duotone. And this was purely born out of, how can we really rinse this small amount of colours? And they really went with the duotone. They could reproduce photography with half-tone, so it's just one colour, and overlay different colours on top to create these kind of different effects. And there was some amazing art that covers that came out of these kind of techniques. I could have shown millions. I think this is one that really strikes me. They're not being super clever, but with just a half-tone black and one sheet of red, they've got this really dynamic, really kind of punchy cover. And this kind of duotone, more kind of like this here, is kind of everywhere. Everyone will see this stuff. It's kind of ubiquitous at the time. It's quite trendy now to have this kind of stuff. I remember 10, 15 years ago this being a thing, and it went away again. Now it's a thing again. And it does look really great. And it's absolutely everywhere. If you kind of listen to Spotify, you'll know all about it. And it's interesting to look at this and think that, you know, this kind of really super sharp premium kind of branded, lovely brand is possibly born out of these kind of financial restrictions that a pulp paperback publisher had. The other technique that they came up with to try and stretch their budget and try and be creative within the limitations they had was overprinting. So overprinting was sort of here, where they're laying the blue over the purple to get an extra colour. So you can see they're doing it here. They've only got the green and the pink and the red, but they managed to get these extra colours by overprinting. And especially in the Pelican series, which were non-fiction, more educational books, a lot of the covers are abstract because they're kind of trying to talk about abstract concepts. So some really interesting covers. And I've put this one at the side here because when you start overprinting, here, you know, it's just two colours like here. Here in the middle, you've got kind of three colours overlaid. And anyone who knows, any designers who know a bit about colour theory know that as soon as you start overlaying a lot of colours, everything goes brown. Hence this brown cover. So this brown is made up of this red overlaid over this blue. So, and you can pick these covers up everywhere because they're, you know, they were mass produced, so you can go in charity shops and find them. And if you go to a charity shop and see a Pelican cover or a Penguin cover around the 70s, there's lots and lots and lots of brown, you know there's some overprinting going on there. And overprinting, you know, it's a technique, it's used all over the shop now. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, you've got some record covers, and even modern stuff now, it's a kind of go-to technique. It looks great. There's kind of real interest now in kind of analog printing, screen printing, all sorts of kinds of different printing, and I think this is much more modern. And it's just a technique that's just everywhere. And I just get to mention Joy Division one last time. This is Peter Saville doing a Joy Division cover, and he's going mental with his overprinting. But these kind of parameters of, you know, these designers who were there in the 70s and they had so little money and they had so little budget and were given so kind of little in the way of assets, having to come up with these interesting covers and to stretch those colours out, and how can we, you know, use these to create these interesting designs. It's great to see something like this and think, again, there's that DNA there, there's that kind of story from how has this come about. And this is now a deliberate thing. You know, I've deliberately chosen to, you know, offset these colours and create these kind of effects, all coming out of this kind of like these financial restrictions that Penguin had. So yeah, I hope that some of those examples that I've shown kind of make you think a little bit about the kind of limitations that we have. And, you know, I think those modernist principles as well of really kind of like, you know, give yourself parameters. I think, as Cassie was saying, you have the blank sheet, and when you have all the kind of options, that's really paralyzing. It's always better to start somewhere where you have some kind of dogma, some kind of ideology, or some kind of approach where you think, okay, I'm going to do it this way, and have that in your mind already from the start. I know it's tough, but giving yourself parameters is a great thing. And being someone who works for money, available, I think that's good. You know, we have these parameters. They're set upon. I have these parameters set upon me, and I enjoy working with those parameters now. And I kind of try and embrace it, and I hope that you all can too. Thank you very much.